All right, well tonight, that's loud. All right, tonight we've heard from Dan, who took us through the eyewitness evidence. He showed us that we can trust the gospel accounts, which talk about Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection as being an accurate portrayal of those things. Craig spoke with us about the archaeological discoveries, which substantiate those eyewitness accounts, even in the face of objections from people who are out to disprove it. And we've just heard from Cam, who's spoken to us about how Jesus demonstrated attributes which are possessed by God alone, meaning that he fits the profile of God. Now, Dan asked earlier who watches all the Law and Order shows. I've got a similar question. How many of you are hooked on any one of the CSI franchises? Yes, more people. That's good. I love them. Can't get enough of them. They're all the same, but it doesn't matter. Now, in those shows, they highlight the absolute importance of things like DNA and fingerprint evidence. You know, one fingerprint, even a partial print, is enough to link someone with a crime scene. Do you know why that is? It's because fingerprints are unique. Even if you're an identical twin, no one else on earth has your fingerprint. And the correlation here when we're looking at Jesus is that God has stamped his word with the fingerprints of the Messiah. What am I talking about? Does anyone have any guesses? No? All right, I'm talking about prophecy. In the Old Testament, there are over 300 prophecies, all of which are fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, it's all right. I'm aware of the time. We're not going to go through all 312 or whatever there is. We're just going to look at one in detail, but I'm going to, before we get to that, I'm just going to run through some things to be aware of when you're looking at biblical prophecy. Now, whenever I hear people talk about biblical prophecy, there's usually two responses, whether they are absolutely ignorant of it, whether they're skeptical, or whether they've just flat out don't want to believe, and they just got their sort of like, nah, don't talk to me. And the two most common responses are either firstly, well, if it did happen, it just happened by chance. It lucked out that they happened in terms of Jesus. Or secondly, they try and flip it around and say that Jesus was a hoax. He deliberately set out to try, he spent most of his life studying, trying to figure out what these prophecies were, so that in those 3 years of his ministry, he could deliberately fulfill as many as he could so people would think that he was the Messiah. Now, on the face of it, that sounds, you think, well, yeah, that could be true. But when you dig into it, when you actually investigate, you find that neither of these stand up. The first one, that it just happened by chance. Mathematicians have calculated the odds of prophecies being fulfilled in one person by chance. One mathematician calculated the odds of 8 prophecies being 1 in 10 to the 17th. I don't know what that number would actually be, but it's a big one. This one's bigger. 40 prophecies is 1 in 10 to the 157th. That's 10 with 157 zeros after it. That's a really big number. This one, we couldn't fit all the numbers in. 60 prophecies is 1 in 10 with 895 zeros after it. To put that in perspective, when you're talking about probability in maths, those of you who are still in high school have probably done stuff on probability, mathematically it's considered statistically impossible if it's any more than 1 in 10 to the 47th. So that means 8 prophecies, sure, maybe by chance that possibly could happen. Unlikely, but possible. 60, you got no chance. And like I said, there's over 300. So, again, another context. Your odds of winning the lottery are 1.4 in 10 to the 7th. So everyone here could win the lottery. It'd be more likely for everyone in this hall right now to win the lottery than for 300 prophecies to be fulfilled in one person by chance. I don't know about you, but when I hear people say, oh, it was just luck, I try not to laugh. It doesn't stand up. That brings us to the second objection, that Jesus deliberately orchestrated his ministry to make himself look like God, that he set out to fulfill these prophecies. Now, granted, there are some prophecies of the 300 which he could do that for. However, the majority of those are things which are completely outside his control. For example, would anyone here like to hazard a guess as how you could manipulate who your great grandfather was? Anyone? Could you control the circumstances surrounding your birth? The nature of your birth, the things which dictate that your parents had to travel around, had to flee to Egypt, had to come back. No, you're unborn or just a tiny little baby. You have no control over those things. The prophecies include the methods of his death, the fact that he was betrayed, and specific details about the nature of his death, about what would happen to him when he hung on the cross. So a large number of those prophecies are completely outside his control. And I've got one just up here which really fascinates me. It was probably the first one which really got me interested in biblical prophecy. A number of you are familiar with it, particularly if you come to DG. I've spoken about this one to you guys a lot. So, and it's Daniel's 70-week prophecy. I'm not going to go into it in any detail. You'll find it in Daniel 9 if this sparks your interest, and you'll find a full working through of this. I'm just summarizing it now in the extended notes. Now, this isn't a prophecy like a lot of the other ones, which are he'll be born here or this or that. This is a mathematical prophecy. And what I mean by that is the prophecy was there's going to be an event, a decree. Craig, if we could. Yep. There'll be a decree given. Turned out to be given by a guy called Artaxerxes, weird name. But the nature of the decree that it will allow the captive Jews to return to their country and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. The end point of this decree is the presentation of the Messiah, the prophesied Messiah, Savior, to his people as the king. And the mathematical part is it says that between these two events, there are 173,880 days. We know from history, I've got the dates up there, that the decree of Artaxerxes happened on the 14th of March, 445 BC. If you count forward, you end up on the 6th of April, 32 AD, which is, on the Hebrew calendar, the 10th of Nisan, which is 4 days before the Passover, which is when Jesus was crucified. It's the triumphal entry. That's just one of those prophecies. That sort of thing is completely outside the scope of anyone, any normal person, to manipulate by your own struggles and by your own designs. Now, there's one other thing to keep in mind before we jump in, but when you're thinking about prophecy. Dan earlier mentioned Alexander the Great. Now, at the end of his reign, Greek had become the common language in the known world. Now, I'm talking Greece all the way to India. Greek was the language that was spoken. In Judea, it was exactly the same there. It was the common language. They still knew a bit of Hebrew, but it was used in the same sense that Catholics use Latin today. It's used for religious ceremonies and that sort of thing, but the ordinary people don't really understand it. As a result, there was a demand for their holy scriptures to be translated into a language that they could actually read. And so the ruler of Egypt, we're not sure of the exact date, it's between 300 to 250 BC, commissioned a translation of the Hebrew text into Greek. Now, we have copies of that. It's called the Septuagint. Because it's a Latin word. Basically, it was done by 70 guys, and that's the Latin word for 70. They were very inventive in naming these things. But the important thing when you're thinking of prophecy is that happened, like I said, we're not sure the exact date, but in the 3rd century BC. That means that every one of those 300-odd prophecies are in black and white. We can prove it over 200 years before Christ was born. So there's no possibility of Jesus coming in or the disciples coming in and trying to add things into the text to make Jesus look better than he was. These are things which everybody knew because they read it over and over.